The 4K camera feed on my phone didn't flicker. It rendered the crime in high-definition infrared, casting the edge of my tinder-dry wheat field in sickening shades of green and black. It was 11:42 p.m. I was 12 miles away at a 24-hour farm supply store, staring at a screen that showed Grace Howell, the manicured, venomous president of the Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association, scrambling over my barbed wire fence with a red plastic jerry can. She sloshed kerosene over my crops, her face twisted into a triumphal, manic grin. Then she marched straight toward the lens, her lips moving as she muttered a curse, before slamming a heavy limestone rock directly into the camera casing. The screen exploded into digital static. Seconds later, my security base station back at the house processed one final data packet before the line went dead. The infrared had caught the bright, blinding flash of a striking match, followed by a violent bloom of fire. Grace had finally done it. She had lit the fuse to destroy my 3-generation-old livelihood. But as I threw my truck into gear and tore down the dark country highway at 90 miles an hour, I could see the horizon glowing an angry, unnatural orange. Grace had checked the daytime weather, but she had completely ignored the midnight thermal shift. The hot wind had stalled, flipped a full 180 degrees, and was now whipping the flames straight backward across the property line. She thought she was burning down my field to force a stubborn farmer out of her perfect suburban kingdom. She had no idea she had just set a fire that was racing directly toward her own million-dollar communal clubhouse, or that the digital trap she thought she smashed had already cloned her face to a secure cloud server 500 miles away. To understand how a dispute over tractor noise and a dead drone escalated into a million-dollar arson investigation, a bankrupt neighborhood, and the complete demolition of an HOA empire, you have to go back to a scorching Tuesday afternoon in July. You have to go back to the day Grace Howell first stepped onto my dirt. Today's story is from Isaac Mendoza, a third-generation dryland farmer who measures life not in fiscal quarters, but in seasonal harvests and the depth of the topsoil. Born and raised on the same patch of land his grandfather broke with a horse-drawn plow back in 1944, Isaac views the farm as an enduring family legacy rather than a mere business asset. He does what he does out of a fierce, quiet devotion to the dirt beneath his boots, a grit-hardened commitment to preserving the honest, hard-working livelihood his father passed down to him. Unfazed by the encroaching suburban sprawl and the petty politics of the developers next door, Isaac is a practical man of few words who simply believes that if you treat the land with respect, it will treat you fair in return, and he is entirely prepared to stand his ground against anyone who threatens his family's heritage. Before we dive into today's story, if you like tales like this, smash that like button now, comment below on where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. If you were in Isaac's situation, what would you have done? Let's start a discussion. But now, let's hear Isaac's story, as told in his own words. The dirt on Mendoza Farm has a memory. If you dig down a few inches, past the topsoil and the fertilizer, you'll hit the clay my grandfather broke with a horse-drawn plow in 1944. My father worked this same ground until his knees gave out, and I've spent the last 15 years keeping the family name on the deed. It's hard, quiet work, and the land treats you fair if you treat it fair. But land doesn't stay quiet when a developer buys up the timber lot on your eastern boundary, flattens the hills, and drops 70 identical million-dollar stucco houses right against your fence line. They named the place Evergreen Estates. It was a stupid name, considering the first thing the bulldozers did was clear-cut 300 acres of old-growth pine to make room for a community swimming pool and a gated entrance. Within a year, I went from looking at a dark wall of trees at sunset to staring directly into the floor-to-ceiling windows of people who wore athleisure wear to pick up their mail. I tried to be a good neighbor. I didn't spray my crops when the wind was blowing east. I kept my tractors off the boundary roads during their weekend block parties. But you can't run a commercial wheat farm without making dust. And you can't harvest 300 acres of grain before the autumn rains without working past sundown. The conflict didn't simmer. It boiled over on a Tuesday in late July. The heat index was pushing 40, and the air smelled like baked earth and dry chaff. I was up in the cab of my John Deere combine, cutting the first trial rows of the season along the eastern fence line. The engine was a steady, rhythmic thrum beneath my boots, a sound I've found comforting since I was a boy. Up ahead, through the dust-streaked glass of the cab, I spotted a flash of bright white moving along the perimeter. I slowed the rig, idling the engine down to a low growl. Standing on the narrow strip of gravel that separated my dirt road from the manicured, emerald green lawn of the estates was a woman. She was wearing a crisp, white linen pantsuit that looked entirely incompatible with the real world, a pair of oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard held against her chest like a shield. It was Grace Howell. I knew her face from the local zoning board meetings, where she'd unsuccessfully tried to petition the county to ban heavy agricultural transport on the secondary highway. She was the president of the Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association, a title she carried with the gravity of a medieval monarch. I cut the thrashing mechanism, opened the cab door, and climbed down the metal ladder. The heat hit me like a physical wall, thick with the smell of diesel and cut wheat. "Can I help you, Miss Howell?" I asked, wiping a layer of sweat and grit from my forehead with the back of my sleeve. I didn't cross the fence. I stood on my dirt. She stood on her gravel. Grace didn't smile. She adjusted her sunglasses, peering down her nose at me as if I were a particularly unpleasant weed that had sprouted through her patio bricks. "Mr. Mendoza," she said, her voice carrying that sharp, clipped cadence common to people who spend their lives managing committee meetings. "I've been standing out here for 20 minutes trying to get your attention. Do you have any idea what time it is?" I checked my watch. "6:15. "Exactly," she said, tapping her acrylic nail against the clipboard. According to the Evergreen Estates Decorum and Covenant Guidelines, Section 4, Paragraph B, all heavy machinery, construction, and disruptive acoustic activities must cease precisely at 6 p.m. on weekdays. The noise from this contraption is echoing directly into our courtyard. I stared at her for a second, letting the engine of the John Deere idle behind me. "Ms. Howell, that's a combine harvester, and this is a farm." "I am well aware of what it is, Mr. Mendoza, and I am telling you that you are in direct violation of our community standards. The dust your machinery is kicking up is drifting over the privacy wall and settling on Mrs. Gallagher's pristine patio furniture. It's unacceptable." She detached a yellow slip of paper from her clipboard and extended it across the wire fence. I didn't take it. I just looked at it. The header read Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association, Notice of Civil Violation and Fine. Underneath, someone had written $500. Excessive noise and environmental pollution in precise, looping cursive. "You're handing me a ticket?" I asked, a genuine laugh bubbling up in my chest. "It is a formal citation," Grace corrected, her chin tilting upward. "You have 14 business days to remit payment to the Treasury office at the clubhouse. Failure to do so will result in a daily compounding interest fee of 10%. I reached out, took the yellow paper from her hand, and looked at it. It felt flimsy. I looked past her shoulder, noting the massive two-story community clubhouse with its cedar shingles and wraparound porch sitting just 200 yards away on the common ground. A few residents were lounging by the pool, watching us. "Miss Howell," I said, leaning my arm against the sturdy cedar post of my fence. "Take a look at the ground beneath your feet." She frowned, looking down at the gravel. "Now look at mine," I continued. "See that barbed wire? That's the property line. My grandfather put that fence in 50 years before your developers poured their first concrete footer. My land is zoned heavy agricultural by the county. Your HOA rules stop exactly where the dirt turns back to gravel." Grace's face tightened, a faint flush of red creeping up her neck, clashing with her white suit. "The environmental impact of your operation does not respect property lines, Mr. Mendoza. Your noise and your debris are actively depreciating the aesthetic value of our community. As the president of this association, it is my duty to protect our residents' investments." "Then tell your residents to close their windows," I said. I bent down, pulled a thick clump of dark, sticky mud off the heel of my work boot, and used the yellow $500 citation to scrape it clean. Once the paper was thoroughly ruined and coated in wet clay, I dropped it into the bed of my utility truck. "You cannot simply ignore a legal notice," Grace snapped, her voice rising an octave, losing its polished edge. "It's not a legal notice, Grace. It's a piece of trash," I said, climbing back up the metal ladder of the combine. I paused on the top platform, looking down at her. She looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the open sky and the wide fields. "I've got 60 acres to cut before the dew sets in tonight. If you don't get off my access road, you're going to breathe in a lot more than dust." I pulled the heavy cab door shut, cutting off her reply. I engaged the thrashing mechanism, shifted the massive machine back into gear, and let the roar of the engine drown out the rest of Evergreen Estates. Through the rearview mirror, I watched Grace Howell stand her ground for 3 seconds before the first wave of dry chaff and dust billowed over the fence line. She turned on her heel, her white linen suit disappearing into the cloud as she marched back toward her kingdom. I smiled. shook my head, and pushed the throttle forward. I figured that would be the end of it. A proud woman getting her feelings hurt by a farmer who didn't care about her title. I was wrong, of course. Entitled people don't stop when you laugh at them. They just wait until the dark to stop laughing back. By Friday morning, it was clear Grace Howell didn't know how to let things go. I drove my old Ford F-250 down to the mailbox at the end of the county road to pick up the weekly farm journals and a couple of invoices from the feed store. When I opened the rusted metal door, a thick stack of crisp, white envelopes fell out into my lap. Every single one of them was printed with the official logo of the Evergreen Estates Homeowners Association, embossed in an obnoxious forest green ink. I sat in the truck cabin with the engine idling, flipping through the letters. The first one was a notice of visual nuisance. According to the bylaws Grace had cited, the rusted-out chassis of my father's old '74 International Harvester, which had been sitting peacefully under the shade of an oak tree on my land since 1992, was a blight upon the shared horizon line. The fine was $250. The second envelope held a citation for acoustic disruption of communal wellness. Apparently, my 3 roosters were crowing at 5:15 a.m., which directly interfered with a sunrise outdoor yoga class being held on the clubhouse lawn. That was another $300. The third, fourth, and fifth letters were variants of the same theme: dust drift, fence-line weeds exceeding 4 inches in height, and the offensive odor of natural manure fertilizer. By the time I reached the bottom of the stack, the total amount Grace was demanding from me had ballooned to nearly $4,000. I tossed the stack onto the passenger seat, drove back up the gravel lane, and walked straight into the house. I didn't even bother opening them all. I pulled the iron latch on my wood-burning stove, threw the entire bundle of white envelopes onto the cold ash, struck a match, and watched Evergreen Estates legal authority turn into gray smoke. It made for excellent kindling to boil my morning coffee. But a paper campaign is like a weed. If you don't pull it by the root, it keeps spreading. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated from formal letters to physical presence. Every time I ran the tractor along the eastern border, I'd look up and see Grace standing on the common ground, her clipboard tucked firmly under her arm. Sometimes she was alone. Other times she had a couple of intimidated-looking board members trailing behind her like a royal court. She'd point at my fields, scribble furiously on her pad, and hold up her phone to take photos of my operation. One afternoon, I was out by the perimeter patch clearing out some dead brush with a chainsaw when I heard a high-pitched, mechanical whine overhead. I cut the motor and looked up. A sleek, white quadcopter drone was hovering about 20 feet above my head, its camera lens tilting downward to track my movements. I followed the line of sight back toward the estates. Standing on the clubhouse balcony, holding a remote control console with a massive iPad attached, was Grace. She was deliberately piloting the thing over my property line to spy on my layout. I didn't get angry. On a farm, you learn quickly that getting mad doesn't fix a broken axle, and it certainly doesn't fix a broken neighbor. Instead, I walked back to the machine shed, retrieved a long piece of PVC pipe, and tied a bright orange strip of surveyor's tape to the end of it. The next time the drone buzzed over my fence line to get a close-up of my fuel tanks, I simply raised the pipe into the air. The plastic propellers caught the surveyor's tape, wrapped it tight, and the drone spun out of control, crashing into a spectacular heap of plastic and wires right into the middle of my fresh muck pile. Through my binoculars, I watched Grace stomp her foot on the clubhouse deck, slam her console onto a table, and march inside. The next morning, the local mail carrier, a guy named Randy who had been delivering our mail since I was in high school, shook his head as he handed me a fresh certified letter. "She's really got a bee in her bonnet about you, Isaac," Randy said, leaning out the window of his mail truck. "She tried to make me sign an affidavit saying I witnessed you destroying community property. I told her I just deliver the mail." "Appreciate it, Randy," I said, looking down at the new envelope. This one wasn't a fine. It was an official summons to an open board meeting at the Evergreen Estates Clubhouse, scheduled for the following Tuesday. The letter warned that if I failed to appear to address my outstanding community debts and hostile actions, the association would pursue a civil lien against my estate through the county court. A civil lien on a third-generation farm. She was actually trying to put a claim on my land because of some dust and a dead drone. I folded the letter, shoved it into my back pocket, and looked out over the golden acres of wheat rippling in the midday heat. The harvest was less than a week away, and the grain was dry enough to catch fire from a single stray spark. I didn't have time for suburban politics. But I also knew guys like my dad didn't let people threaten their dirt without showing up to look them in the eye. "All right, Grace," I muttered to the empty field. "You want me in your clubhouse? I'll show up." The thing about a herd of Black Angus cattle is that they don't care about property lines, but they do care about routine. They know when the feed truck is coming, they know where the shade is, and they know that a closed gate means they stay put. So, when I came out to the north pasture on a Thursday morning and found my heavy iron perimeter gate swinging wide open, my stomach dropped. The gate didn't just unlatch itself. It was secured with a heavy steel drop pin and a thick chain wrapper. To open it, you had to physically lift the pin and throw the chain back over the fence post. Beyond that open gateway lay the perfectly manicured, chemical-soaked fairway of the Evergreen Estates communal green space. If those 50 head of cattle had wandered through, they would have torn that delicate turf to shreds with their hooves, eaten their prize-winning ornamental shrubs, and likely left a trail of destruction that would have actually given Grace Howell a real, legally actionable reason to sue me. Luckily, the herd was still huddled under the shade of the old cottonwood tree near the creek, chewing their cud and ignoring the open invitation to cause chaos. I hauled the gate shut, slamming the iron pin down so hard it rang out across the valley. I examined the dirt around the post. The ground was dry, but there were distinct, narrow tracks left by a pair of expensive running shoes, the kind with the grid-like tread patterns that none of my farmhands would ever wear. The tracks came from the Evergreen Estates side of the fence, walked straight up to the latch, and then retreated back toward the subdivision. Grace was playing dirty now. She wasn't just writing fines anymore. She was actively trying to manufacture a disaster to prove her point. I drove my truck straight into town and paid a visit to Miller's Hardware. I didn't buy a standard padlock. If someone was willing to cross my line to tamper with my livestock, a padlock would just get snipped with bolt cutters, and I'd be left with no proof. Instead, I walked over to the security aisle and spent $600 on a commercial-grade, weather-resistant trail camera setup. Going after poachers, Isaac? Old Man Miller asked as he scanned the boxes. Something like that, I said, rubbing the back of my neck. Just a pest that doesn't know where its territory ends. The cameras were high-tech, solar-powered units designed for remote oil rigs. They shot in full 4K resolution, even in total darkness, using infrared lenses that didn't cast a visible glow. But the most important feature was the independent cellular antenna housed inside the reinforced casing. The moment the lens detected movement, it compressed the footage and transmitted it via a cellular network directly to a secure cloud server. Even if someone found the camera, tore it off the post, and threw it in the creek, the footage was already sitting on a server 500 miles away. It was an unerasable digital witness. I spent the rest of the afternoon mounting the units along the eastern boundary. I hid the first one inside the hollow trunk of a dead oak tree near the north gate. I mounted the second one high up on a creosote telephone pole overlooking my diesel storage tanks. The third unit, camera number 4, I saved for the most vulnerable stretch of my land. I clamped it securely to a heavy steel fence post right at the corner where my tinder-dry wheat field shared a direct border with the Evergreen Estates clubhouse property. The lens had a panoramic view of the golden stalks, the boundary line, and the rear deck of the communal building. That evening, I sat on my porch with a cold beer and my iPad, testing the live streams. The picture quality was crystal clear. I could see the individual ears of wheat swaying gently in the evening breeze. I could see the shadow of the clubhouse stretching across the grass. And, around 8 p.m., I watched the live feed on my screen as a familiar figure walked out onto the clubhouse balcony. Grace Howell stood at the railing, holding a glass of white wine, staring directly out across the dark expanse of my farm. Even through the digital screen, her posture radiated an intense, simmering frustration. She was looking at my land like it was a stain on her perfect canvas, an obstacle that needed to be scrubbed away. I took a sip of my beer and locked the screen. The trap was set, and the digital eyes were open. I had the Evergreen Estates board meeting coming up in 48 hours. I intended to walk into their clubhouse, hand them a log of the trespassing evidence I'd already collected, and give them one final chance to pull their president back into line. If they didn't, my next call was going to be to the county sheriff. The Evergreen Estates clubhouse smelled exactly like what it was: expensive cedar, heavy air conditioning, and a distinct undercurrent of unearned authority. The main hall featured vaulted timber ceilings and a stone fireplace that had clearly never seen a real log. At the far end of the room, behind a long folding table covered in green felt, sat the 5 members of the HOA executive board. Grace Howell occupied the center chair, looking every bit the corporate queen in a sharp navy blazer, her silver hair styled into an immovable helmet. The room was packed. About 50 residents sat in rows of padded chairs, murmuring anxiously among themselves. clutching printouts of the community budget. I didn't take a seat. I stood at the back of the room, leaning against the double doors in my work flannel and muddy boots, consciously projecting the image of the exact man they were terrified of, a guy who actually worked for a living. I waited through 40 minutes of agonizing debate over pool maintenance schedules and the appropriate shade of beige for driveway pavers. Finally, Grace tapped her gavel against a wooden block. The sharp crack echoed through the rafters. "Moving on to item 7 on the agenda," Grace announced, her voice amplifying smoothly through the room's built-in sound system. "Community perimeter security and the ongoing civil violations by Mendoza Farm." A collective sigh and rustle of paper went through the crowd. Heads began turning, searching the room until 50 pairs of eyes locked onto me at the back wall. "Mr. Mendoza," Grace said, her gaze fixing on me with frigid satisfaction. "I am surprised you showed up. I assume you are here to present a certified check for the $4,200 in outstanding fines your agricultural operation owes this association." I walked down the center aisle, my heavy work boots thudding rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor. The residents leaned away from me as I passed, as if farm dust were contagious. I stopped right in front of the felt-covered table. "I'm not here to pay you a dime, Grace," I said, keeping my voice level, conversational, and entirely devoid of the fear she expected. "I'm here to give this board a final warning before I let the county sheriff handle you." Grace scoffed, a tight, patronizing smile twitching on her lips. "The sheriff? Mr. Mendoza, you are the one in gross violation of our community standards. Your machinery creates noise pollution, your crops present a visual blight, and your wanton destruction of our neighborhood security drone, which cost this association $1,500, is a criminal matter. That drone was trespassing 20 feet inside my property line, spying on my fuel tanks," I said, looking past her to the other 4 board members. There was an older guy named Bob on the left who looked like a retired accountant, and a younger woman who was nervously chewing her pen. "And as for your fines, I've already told you. Your bylaws stop at the barbed wire. I answer to the county zoning laws. You have zero legal jurisdiction over my land. We have a duty to protect our residents' property values." Grace snapped, her composure slipping just a fraction, her knuckles tightening around her pen. "Then protect them from your own president," I countered. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. I tossed it onto the table. It slid across the green felt, stopping right in front of Bob the accountant. "Open it, Bob." Bob looked at Grace, hesitated, and then pulled out a stack of high-resolution photographs I'd printed from my computer that morning. "Those are time-stamped photos from Tuesday night," I told the room, making sure my voice carried to the back rows. "They show a clear view of my north pasture gate, and that woman walking across the line in her expensive running shoes, unlatching my chain, and trying to let 50 head of black Angus cattle loose onto your golf course? That's Grace." A sharp murmur rippled through the audience. Bob's mouth went slightly slack as he stared at the photos. The young woman chewing her pen stopped and leaned over to look. "This is absurd. These are doctored, malicious fabrications." Grace slammed her palm onto the table, standing up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. "I have never stepped foot on that filthy, unkempt property. They're from a commercial trail cam system, Grace. Every image has an encrypted digital signature that will hold up perfectly in a court of law," I said, leaning forward, placing my hands on the edge of the table. "If those cattle had come through that gate, they would have caused $50,000 in property damage to your lawns, and one of your residents could have hit a 2-ton bull with their luxury SUV on the access road. You didn't just trespass, you tried to engineer a disaster." "Grace, is this real?" Bob muttered, his face turning an uneasy shade of gray as he looked up from the photos. "Of course it isn't, Bob. Don't be naive," Grace hissed, her eyes darting frantically around the room, realizing the crowd wasn't blindly following her script anymore. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "He's trying to intimidate us. He wants to bankrupt our association because he hates our progress." "I don't care about your association," I said, straightening up and stepping back. "But I do care about my livelihood. My wheat harvest starts next week. It's dry out there, and I don't have time to play games. I'm giving this board 48 hours to formally rescind every fraudulent ticket you've sent me, and I want a written guarantee that this woman stays on her side of the fence." "And if we don't?" Grace challenged, her voice dripping with a desperate, defensive venom. "Then I take these photos, along with the unedited video files, straight to the county prosecutor's office. Trespassing, tampering with livestock, and reckless endangerment. I wonder how the Evergreen Estates property values will look when their president is wearing an orange jumpsuit. I didn't wait for her reply. I turned on my heel and walked back down the center aisle. The silence in the room was absolute this time, save for the heavy, confident thud of my boots. I could feel Grace's eyes boring into the back of my neck, practically radiating a blind, unstable rage. She had spent years treating this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom, and I had just stripped away her armor in front of her subjects. As I pushed through the heavy glass double doors into the warm summer night air, I knew I hadn't solved the problem. I had just backed a dangerous, entitled creature into a corner, and a creature like Grace Howell doesn't surrender. She lashes out. The dry heat of late August always feels like a ticking clock. By the time Monday rolled around, the humidity had plummeted into the single digits, and the wind out of the southwest was coming in hot and steady, blowing like a giant hairdryer across the valley. I stood at the edge of my eastern boundary, rolling a head of wheat between my palms. The husks cracked apart easily, releasing the hard, golden kernels into my hand. I bit down on one. It snapped perfectly. It was tinder dry and packed with protein. Tomorrow morning, I muttered to myself. This was the high-stakes gamble of dryland farming. A single heavy hailstorm or a rogue thunderstorm could ruin 300 acres of premium grain in 20 minutes. But right now, the crop was worth roughly $250,000 sitting on the stalk. If we could get the combines rolling by 6 a.m., we'd have it all in the grain bins before the weekend. The 48-hour deadline I'd given the Evergreen Estates Board had passed at noon. I hadn't received a written apology, but I hadn't received any new fines either. The subdivision on the other side of the fence felt eerily quiet. I looked over at the clubhouse. The blinds were drawn, and the pool deck was empty. From this distance, the cedar-shingled building looked peaceful, but I knew better. Bob the accountant had probably spent the weekend panicking over the legal fallout of Grace's little midnight excursion into my pasture. I walked back to the machine shed to perform the final pre-harvest maintenance checks. My two hired hands, a pair of local brothers named Caleb and Luke, were already greasing the fittings on the secondary combine and checking the hydraulic fluid lines. "Everything's tight, Isaac," Caleb said, wiping his greasy hands on a rag as I walked in. "The weather report says the wind is supposed to die down around midnight, but it's going to be a scorcher tomorrow. We'll want to move fast." "We start at first light," I told them. "Take the trucks into town, get them topped off with diesel, and get some dinner. I'll stay here and do a final sweep of the perimeter roads to make sure there aren't any stray rocks or debris that could foul the cutter bars." By 9 p.m., the sun had finally slipped below the western horizon, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating darkness. The air was still thick with heat. I took my old F-250 out for one last slow patrol along the fence line, my headlights cutting through the swirling dust. When I drove past the corner where my land met the clubhouse common ground, I glanced up at the creosote telephone pole. The small green indicator light on camera number 4 blinked once every 10 seconds, a tiny, invisible guardian tethered to the cloud. I checked my phone. The signal was strong. The live stream showed nothing but the golden wall of wheat swaying slightly in the dying breeze. Satisfied, I drove back to the house, but an uneasy feeling refused to settle in my gut. At 10:30 p.m., my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, expecting a weather alert, but it was a text from the manager at the 24-hour farm supply store in town, 12 miles away. A batch of heavy-duty drive belts I'd back-ordered for the John Deere header had finally arrived on the late delivery truck. If a belt snapped tomorrow during the heat of the harvest, I'd lose hours waiting for a replacement. I looked out the window. The farm was dead silent. The house sat dark, and the machinery was tucked safely away in the shed. "Just a quick run," I told myself, grabbing my keys. I climbed into the truck and started the engine. As I pulled down the long gravel lane, leaving the farm empty behind me, I glanced in my rearview mirror at the twinkling streetlights of Evergreen Estates. They looked like a cluster of cold, sterile stars against the dark fabric of the valley. I told myself everything would be fine. The cameras were watching. The cattle were secure. The wheat was waiting. But as the headlights of my truck swallowed the empty highway leading into town, the air felt far too heavy, like the breathless pause right before a lightning strike. The 24-hour farm supply store in town smelled like industrial grease, rubber tires, and stale coffee. I was standing at the parts counter, checking the serial numbers on the heavy-duty drive belts the clerk had pulled from the back, when my phone began to vibrate violently against my thigh. I pulled it out, expecting a call from Caleb or Luke. Instead, The screen was lit up with a string of urgent red-bordered notifications from my security app. Motion detected. Camera 4 to 11:42 p.m. Motion detected. Camera 4 to 11:43 p.m. My thumb swiped the screen, unlocking the live feed. The high-definition infrared stream loaded instantly, rendering the edge of my wheat field an eerie, glowing shades of green and black. At first, there was nothing but the stalks swaying in the dry night air. Then, a figure stepped into the frame from the Evergreen Estates side of the fence. It was Grace Howell. She wasn't wearing her elegant linen pantsuit tonight. She was dressed in dark jeans and a heavy hooded sweatshirt, but her silver hair was unmistakable under the infrared light. She was carrying a red plastic jerry can. She looked manic, her movements jerky and frantic as she scrambled over my barbed wire fence, snagging her sweater on a barb before ripping herself free. "Everything all right, Isaac?" the store clerk asked, holding out the receipt. I didn't answer. My eyes were glued to the screen. Grace marched 10 feet into my dry wheat field. She unscrewed the cap of the jerry can and began sloshing liquid over the golden stalks, pacing in a frantic circle. The fluid shimmered darkly on the screen. "Kerosene." She stopped, turning her head as if she heard a sound. Her eyes scanned the darkness until they locked directly onto the hollow post where camera number 4 was mounted. She walked straight toward the lens, her face growing larger, filling the screen. Her expression was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you can ruin me, you smug peasant?" Her voice came through the phone's speaker, distorted by the wind, but clear as day. "Let's see what your precious dirt is worth tomorrow." She reached down, grabbed a heavy, jagged limestone rock from the fence line, and brought it smashing down directly into the camera casing. The screen exploded into static. "Isaac?" The clerk's voice sounded distant, alarmed. "Keep the belts," I barked, already sprinting toward the automatic double doors of the storefront. I threw myself into the cab of my F-250, slammed the keys into the ignition, and tore out of the gravel parking lot, the tires screaming as I threw the truck onto the empty highway. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I hit 60, then 70 miles an hour on the dark country road, my phone buzzed one last time on the dashboard. The camera was dead, but the security base station back at my house was still functional, linked to the cloud. A final, automated data packet had processed right before the lens shattered. I glanced down. The system had captured the exact moment she struck the match. The image was terrifyingly clear. The infrared had caught the bright white flash of the initial ignition. Grace was backing away, her face illuminated by the sudden bloom of fire, her lips curled into a twisted, triumphal smile. Behind her, the tinder dry wheat was already exploding into a wall of light. But Grace had made a critical, fatal mistake. She had checked the weather report for the daytime, but she hadn't accounted for the midnight thermal shift. The hot, heavy wind that had been blowing southwest all afternoon had suddenly stalled. As the cold air from the valley floor began to sink, the breeze flipped a full 180 degrees, blowing hard and fast back toward the east, back toward Evergreen Estates. Through the windshield of my truck, still 3 miles out, I saw the horizon glow. It wasn't the soft, amber light of a distant town. It was a violent, angry orange fracture in the night sky. I pushed the accelerator pedal flat against the floorboards, the old V8 engine roaring in protest. I didn't care about my harvest anymore. I didn't care about the $250,000 sitting on the stalk. All I could think about was the pure, terrifying physics of a wind-driven wildfire, and the fact that Grace Howell had just lit a fuse that was burning straight back into her own kingdom. The 24-hour farm supply store in town smelled like industrial grease, rubber tires, and stale coffee. I was standing at the parts counter, checking the serial numbers on the heavy-duty drive belts the clerk had pulled from the back, when my phone began to vibrate violently against my thigh. I pulled it out, expecting a call from Caleb or Luke. Instead, the screen was lit up with a string of urgent, red-bordered notifications from my security app. "Motion detected. Camera 4 to 11:42 p.m. Motion detected. Camera 4 to 11:43 p.m. My thumb swiped the screen, unlocking the live feed. The high-definition infrared stream loaded instantly, rendering the edge of my wheat field an eerie, glowing shades of green and black. At first, there was nothing but the stalks swaying in the dry night air. Then, a figure stepped into the frame from the Evergreen Estates side of the fence. It was Grace Howell. She wasn't wearing her elegant linen pantsuit tonight. She was dressed in dark jeans and a heavy hooded sweatshirt, but her silver hair was unmistakable under the infrared light. She was carrying a red plastic jerry can. She looked manic, her movements jerky and frantic as she scrambled over my barbed wire fence, snagging her sweater on a barb before ripping herself free. "Everything all right, Isaac?" the store clerk asked, holding out the receipt. I didn't answer. My eyes were glued to the screen. Grace marched 10 feet into my dry wheat field. She unscrewed the cap of the jerry can and began sloshing liquid over the golden stalks, pacing in a frantic circle. The fluid shimmered darkly on the screen. "Kerosene." She stopped, turning her head as if she heard a sound. Her eyes scanned the darkness until they locked directly onto the hollow post where camera number 4 was mounted. She walked straight toward the lens, her face growing larger, filling the screen. Her expression was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you can ruin me, you smug peasant?" Her voice came through the phone's speaker, distorted by the wind, but clear as day. "Let's see what your precious dirt is worth tomorrow." She reached down, grabbed a heavy, jagged limestone rock from the fence line, and brought it smashing down directly into the camera casing. The screen exploded into static. "Isaac?" The clerk's voice sounded distant, alarmed. "Keep the belts," I barked, already sprinting toward the automatic double doors of the storefront. I threw myself into the cab of my F-250, slammed the keys into the ignition, and tore out of the gravel parking lot, the tires screaming as I threw the truck onto the empty highway. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. As I hit 60, then 70 miles an hour on the dark country road, my phone buzzed one last time on the dashboard. The camera was dead, but the security base station back at my house was still functional, linked to the cloud. A final, automated data packet had processed right before the lens shattered. I glanced down. The system had captured the exact moment she struck the match. The image was terrifyingly clear. The infrared had caught the bright white flash of the initial ignition. Grace was backing away, her face illuminated by the sudden bloom of fire, her lips curled into a twisted, triumphal smile. Behind her, the tender, dry wheat was already exploding into a wall of light. But Grace had made a critical, fatal mistake. She had checked the weather report for the daytime, but she hadn't accounted for the midnight thermal shift. The hot, heavy wind that had been blowing southwest all afternoon had suddenly stalled. As the cold air from the valley floor began to sink, the breeze flipped a full 180 degrees, blowing hard and fast back toward the east, back toward Evergreen Estates. Through the windshield of my truck, still 3 miles out, I saw the horizon glow. It wasn't the soft amber light of a distant town. It was a violent, angry orange fracture in the night sky. I pushed the accelerator pedal flat against the floorboards, the old V8 engine roaring in protest. I didn't care about my harvest anymore. I didn't care about the $250,000 sitting on the stalk. All I could think about was the pure, terrifying physics of a wind-driven wildfire, and the fact that Grace Howell had just lit a fuse that was burning straight back into her own kingdom. By 5 a.m., the roaring beast across the fence had been reduced to a steaming black skeleton of charred timbers and twisted metal. The sun rose through a thick, gray haze of smoke, casting a sickly yellow light over the ruins of Evergreen Estates. My house was still standing, completely untouched. The fire had taken about 6 acres of my premium wheat before the wind flipped, leaving a jagged black crescent moon carved into my field. It was a painful loss, but it was nothing compared to the absolute obliteration on the other side of the wire. I was sitting on my porch, drinking a mug of black coffee, when 2 official-looking vehicles pulled up my gravel driveway. The first was a White County Sheriff's Cruiser, and the second was an unmarked SUV belonging to the state fire marshal's office. Sheriff Tom Vance, a man I'd gone to high school with, climbed out of the cruiser. Following him was a sharp-eyed woman in a heavy canvas jacket with arson investigator printed across the back. Her name tag read Special Agent Miller. "Morning, Isaac," Tom said, tipping his hat as he walked up the porch steps. "Smells like a war zone out here." "Morning, Tom." "Agent Miller," I said, gesturing to the empty chairs on the porch. "Can I get you some coffee?" "We'll take you up on that inside, Isaac," Agent Miller said, her voice crisp and professional. She wasn't smiling. "We've spent the last 3 hours across the fence. Miss Howell, the HOA President, has filed 3 separate formal statements claiming your harvesting equipment threw a spark into the dry brush last night. She wants you arrested for criminal negligence." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Is that what she told you?" "She was very specific," Tom said, looking uneasy. "She said you've been hostile toward the community, threatening them with legal action, and that you deliberately ran your combine late into the night to sabotage them." I stood up and set my mug down on the porch railing. "Come on inside, folks. I've got something you need to see before we talk about statements." I led them into my kitchen, where the air was clean and smelled of old oak and fresh brew. I pulled out 2 chairs for them at the heavy wooden table, set my laptop down in the center, and opened the browser. I logged into my encrypted security portal. About 3 days ago, someone tampered with my cattle gates, I explained, typing in my password. So I spent $600 on commercial-grade, solar-powered trail cams along the eastern perimeter. They're 4K, motion-activated, and they upload to a secure cloud server instantly via a cellular link. Agent Miller leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as the dashboard loaded. Which camera overlooks the origin point of the fire? Camera number 4, I said, clicking the video archive for 11:40 p.m. It was mounted on a steel post exactly 40 feet inside my property line, facing the clubhouse. I hit play. The screen bloomed in the sharp green and black tones of high-definition infrared. For the first few seconds, there was only the sound of the wind rustling the dry wheat. Then, a figure scrambled over the barbed wire, caught her sweater, tore it free, and marched right into the frame. Tom let out a low, sharp whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Agent Miller didn't speak. She just watched as Grace Howell sloshed kerosene from the red jerry can over my crops. Her face twisted in a manic, glowing grin under the infrared light. The audio was crystal clear. When Grace walked up to the camera lens, holding the jagged limestone rock, her voice echoed through my quiet kitchen. You think you can ruin me, you smug peasant? Let's see what your precious dirt is worth tomorrow. The screen filled with the bright, blinding flash of a striking match, followed by the terrifying, instant roar of the wheat catching fire. Then, the video cut to static as the rock smashed the lens. She thought destroying the camera destroyed the evidence, I said, closing the laptop lid. She didn't realize the data was already sitting on a server 500 miles away before the rock even hit the casing. Agent Miller stood up, a cold, satisfied expression on her face. She adjusted her belt and looked at Tom. That's first-degree commercial arson, criminal vandalism. And considering she tried to pin this on Mr. Mendoza to collect an insurance payout, we're looking at multiple counts of felony insurance fraud. Tom shook his head, a mix of disbelief and anger on his face. She burned down her own neighborhood's crown jewel just to spite a farmer. I've seen some crazy HOA disputes, Tom, but this takes the cake. What's the next step? I asked, leaning back against the kitchen counter. The next step, Agent Miller said, pulling out her radio, is that we let Miss Howell keep digging her hole. The HOA board called an emergency town hall meeting for tonight at 6 o'clock in the high school gym to vote on an emergency cleanup fund. Tom and I are going to attend. And Isaac, I think it would be highly beneficial if you came along to present your report. I looked out the kitchen window at my scorched field, then across the wire at the blackened chimney of the clubhouse. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Agent, I said. By mid-afternoon, the quiet panic of a looming financial disaster had fully settled over Evergreen Estates. I spent the day out in the unburned sections of my field, helping Caleb and Luke prep the John Deere combine for the delayed harvest. From the elevated seat of the cab, I had a perfect view of the neighborhood. The atmosphere across the fence line looked like a colony of ants whose hill had been stepped on by a giant boot. Neighbors were gathered in small, frantic huddles on driveways, waving sheets of paper and shouting at one another. Delivery vans and local real estate trucks were parked along the curbs. I even saw one family packing boxes into a U-Haul, looking as if they were trying to flee a sinking ship before the captain noticed. Around 3 p.m., Bob the accountant drove his pristine white Mercedes luxury SUV down my gravel access lane. He stopped near my tractor, climbed out, and walked up to the fence. He looked 10 years older than he had at the board meeting. His face was a pasty gray. His tie was loosened, and he was sweating through his expensive dress shirt. I climbed down the ladder of the combine and walked over to the wire. Lost your way, Bob? Isaac? He said, his voice cracking slightly. He reached out as if to grab the fence post, then thought better of it and dropped his hand. I just came over to see how much damage your crop took. The board wants to ensure we have an accurate assessment. 6 acres, I said, leaning my arm against the cedar post. Premium protein-grade wheat. It's going to cost your association about $15,000 just to replace the raw grain, not including the cleanup of the toxic plastic and vinyl residue your clubhouse blew onto my topsoil. Bob swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. 15,000. Right. Well, that's the least of our problems right now, Isaac. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and smoothed it out against his thigh. It was a copy of the emergency notice that had been taped to every front door in Evergreen Estates an hour earlier. The insurance investigators from the master policy group were out here at noon, Bob muttered, staring blankly at the paper. They found traces of accelerant near the origin point on your side of the fence. They've officially placed a fraud hold on our entire property claim. They won't release a single dollar for demolition or rebuilding until the criminal investigation is resolved. Makes sense, I said, keeping my face entirely blank. Insurance companies don't like paying out for arson. We don't have the reserves for this, Isaac. Bob suddenly burst out, his professional composure shattering completely. The cleanup alone, clearing the toxic debris, securing the stone chimney before it collapses onto the road, environmental remediation for the pool, it's going to cost over $1 million out of pocket. We had to call an emergency meeting for 6 o'clock tonight. He pointed to the bottom of the sheet, where a line of bold red text detailed the grim reality. We're levying an emergency special assessment, Bob whispered, his voice trembling. $15,000 per household. Cash or certified check, due within 30 days. If the residents don't pay, the association has to start filing foreclosure liens against our own neighbors just to keep from going bankrupt. I looked past him at the sprawling stucco houses. The people living in them had moving budgets and country club memberships, but very few families had 15 grand in cash sitting around to pay for a building that was already smoke and ash. Grace's little midnight tantrum hadn't just destroyed a clubhouse, she had effectively ruined the financial stability of 70 families. Grace is still pushing the spark theory, Bob said, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. She's insisting the county prosecutor arrest you. She claims that once you're convicted, your farm's commercial liability insurance will have to pay for our new clubhouse. She's a visionary, Bob, I said, tapping the fence post. Always thinking ahead. Are you coming tonight? Bob asked, looking at me with a desperate, pathetic kind of hope in his eyes. To the high school gym? The whole community is going to be there. They're ready to tear the board apart. Oh, I'll be there, I told him, looking out over my golden remaining crops. Wouldn't miss it for the world. I've got a vested interest in your community's aesthetics now. Bob nodded miserably, climbed back into his Mercedes, and drove away, his tires kicking up a cloud of my farm dust. I watched him go, then turned to Caleb and Luke, who were waiting by the grain truck. Lock the machinery up for the night, boys, I said, wiping my hands on a shop rag. We're going to town to watch a kingdom fall. The Lincoln High School gymnasium smelled of old floor wax, damp varnish, and a thick, suffocating cloud of pure suburban panic. Every single bleacher seat was filled, and the overflow crowd spilled onto the varnished hardwood court, clustered in angry, shouting huddles. The air conditioning was failing under the heat of 70 furious families. At the center of the basketball court stood a single folding table equipped with a PA microphone. Behind it sat the remaining 4 members of the Evergreen Estates HOA board, looking like men facing a firing squad. And right at the center, standing tall behind the microphone in a flawless charcoal blazer and an unbothered expression, was Grace Howell. I stood at the back of the gym, leaning my shoulder against the heavy metal double doors. I was wearing my work flannel, my heavy boots, and a thick layer of field dust. I wasn't alone. Standing quietly to my left was Sheriff Tom Vance, and to my right was Special Agent Miller from the State Fire Marshal's office, holding a vanilla folder and a black USB drive. Order! Grace's voice exploded through the gym speakers, a sharp, metallic ring that made the front row flinch. She slammed her wooden gavel against the folding table. Please, let's maintain our decorum. Screaming at the board will not change our immediate financial reality. $15,000? A man in the third row shouted, waving the red-bordered notice in the air. It was Bob, the resident who had been trying to sell his house. My buyers walked away this morning, Grace. I don't have 15 grand to give you for a pile of ash. None of us do, Bob, a woman screamed from the bleachers. My kid's college fund is in that assessment. Grace raised her hands, palms outward, projecting the soothing, patronizing tone of a politician. I understand the frustration. I feel it too. But we must look at the facts. The insurance company has placed a temporary administrative hold on our claim because they are investigating the origin point, and we all know exactly where that fire came from. She turned her head, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked directly onto me at the back of the gym. She pointed a manicured finger right at my chest. The fire originated on Mendoza Farm, Grace announced, her voice rising with calculated righteousness. Mr. Mendoza has been running heavy, unmaintained agricultural machinery late into the night, deliberately violating our noise ordinances. His negligence threw a spark into his own dry fields, and the wind carried it to our beautiful clubhouse. He is trying to shift the blame to avoid his debts. A murmur of confused anger rolled through the gym, heads turning toward the back doors. Our legal counsel is already drafting a multi-million-dollar civil suit against his farm, Grace continued, a smug, triumphal smile touching her lips as she leaned into the microphone. We will seize his land if we have to, but until the county court forces his insurance to pay, we must secure our own borders. We need the emergency assessment to clean up our community's aesthetic footprint. Now, as president, I am calling for an immediate board vote to pass. Don't bother counting the votes, Grace, I said. My voice wasn't amplified by a microphone, but it carried across the hardwood floor like a crack of thunder. The gym went dead silent. The sea of residents parted down the center aisle as I began walking slowly toward the front table. Mr. Mendoza, Grace hissed into the PA system, her face instantly tightening, a flash of defensive rage crossing her eyes. This is a private, mandatory assembly for the homeowners of Evergreen Estates. You are a non-member, a hostile party, and you are currently trespassing. Sheriff Vance, remove this man. Tom Vance didn't move an inch from the back door. He just crossed his arms. I reached the front of the court and stopped 5 feet from the table. I looked past Grace at Bob the accountant, who was staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my iPad, and tapped the screen. Funny thing about my farm, Grace, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet room. The boundary fence sits exactly 40 feet inside my property line. And on post number 4, right where you like to stand and take your photos, I have a 4K motion-activated trail camera. It runs on solar power, and it has an independent cellular uplink. The exact second it detects movement, it uploads encrypted video directly to a secure cloud server. Grace's face didn't just lose color. It went a sickly, translucent gray, the shade of old milk. Her hand dropped the gavel. I don't care about your surveillance hobbies, Mr. Mendoza, she stammered, her voice cracking through the speakers as she tried to pull the microphone closer. The state fire marshal is currently conducting a professional investigation. Actually, the investigator already finished her report, Special Agent Miller said, her heavy boots clicking loudly against the gym floor as she walked down the center aisle. She held up the black USB drive. And she loved the clarity of the cloud data. Agent Miller walked straight to the high school's media console at the side of the stage. She plugged the drive into the system, tapped a few keys on the wall panel, and the giant digital projector screen above the basketball hoop slowly rolled down. Turn off the gym lights, Tom Vance called out from the back. The lights clicked off, plunging the gym into darkness, save for the massive, glowing rectangle of the projector screen. The high-definition infrared footage loaded instantly. The 70 families of Evergreen Estates watched in absolute, horrified silence as a figure in dark clothing scrambled over my barbed wire fence at 11:42 p.m. The infrared rendering was flawless. The silver hair, the sharp profile, the manic franticness. There was no denying who it was. The crowd let out a collective, gasping breath as the video showed Grace Howell sloshing a red jerry can of kerosene over my dry wheat stalks. Then she turned, walked straight up to the camera lens, and her voice boomed through the high school gym's surround sound speakers, clear, crisp, and heavy with venom. You think you can ruin me, you smug peasant? Let's see what your precious dirt is worth tomorrow. On the screen, a match struck, casting a brilliant white flare across her smiling face before the tender dry wheat exploded into a wall of roaring flame. The footage ended with the jagged limestone rocks smashing into the lens, cutting to sharp digital static. The gym lights clicked back on. The silence lasted for 3 agonizing seconds before the entire room erupted into absolute, unhinged chaos. Screams, curses, and chairs scraping against the floor filled the air. Residents were standing on top of the bleachers, shaking their fists at the stage. You did this? Bob the seller roared, pushing past the folding table, pointing a shaking hand at her. You burned our clubhouse? You ruined our property values? The insurance won't pay a cent, Bob the accountant shrieked, his voice hitting a frantic, high-pitched register as he clutched his head. A crime committed by a board member completely voids the policy. We're ruined. We're legally liable for the cleanup. Grace was backing away from the podium, her hands raised defensively, her eyes darting frantically toward the emergency exit doors behind the stage. It was a controlled burn. He was violating the covenants. He was threatening our aesthetic stability. He wouldn't pay the fines. She didn't make it to the exit. Sheriff Tom Vance and two state troopers met her at the edge of the stage. Tom pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt, the metallic click ringing out clearly over the shouts of the crowd. "Grace Howell," Tom said, his voice booming across the gym. "You are under arrest for first-degree commercial arson, criminal vandalism, and multiple counts of felony insurance fraud. Hands behind your back." As the troopers clicked the cuffs into place and began leading her down the center aisle, the crowd surged forward, shouting insults, filming her disgrace on their phones. Grace kept her head down, her silver hair falling over her face, her absolute authority completely broken. As they led her past me, she stopped for a brief second. Her eyes locked onto mine, filled with a desperate, venomous hatred. I didn't smile. I didn't say a word. I just reached up and gave the brim of my baseball cap a polite, slow, three-generation-old tip. "Have a nice night, Madam President," I murmured. The high school gym had emptied out by midnight, but the shockwave Grace left behind took weeks to fully settle. By mid-September, the suburban illusion of Evergreen Estates had completely shattered. If you walked along my eastern fence line, you didn't hear the smooth hum of pool filters or the polite murmur of neighborhood lawnmowers anymore. You heard the harsh, echoing clatter of diesel dump trucks and heavy yellow excavators. Because a board member had committed the arson, the master insurance company didn't just put a hold on the claim. They officially denied it. Every single cent of the cleanup, the debris removal, and the environmental remediation for the scorched community pool fell squarely on the shoulders of the homeowners. The $15,000 emergency special assessment was no longer a threat. It was a binding legal reality. I was out in the machine shed on a Tuesday morning, wiping down the hydraulic lines on my secondary tractor, when a shadow fell across the concrete floor. I looked up to see Bob, the retired accountant who had sat on Grace's left during her reign, walking into the light. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He was in faded jeans and an old windbreaker, looking smaller and a lot more human. He stopped a few feet from my workbench, holding a leather briefcase against his ribs like a shield. "Morning, Isaac." "Bob," I said, setting my wrench down on the metal table. "Something I can do for you?" "I'm the interim president now," he said, giving a wry, humorless laugh that ended in a sigh. "The rest of the old board resigned the morning after the arrest. The residents called a special election. I guess nobody else wanted to steering a sinking ship." "Congratulations," I said. "Sounds like a hell of a promotion." Bob walked over to the edge of the doorway, looking out through the open door toward the fence line where the excavators were scooping charred timber skeletons into a massive steel dumpster. "We're launching a joint civil lawsuit against Grace," Bob said, his voice dropping into a quiet, intense register. 42 individual families have signed on so far, plus the association itself. We're suing her personally for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and total property devaluation. We're targeting her house, her savings, her retirement accounts, everything she owns. He opened his briefcase, pulled out a neat, stapled document, and laid it on my workbench. "The lawyers need a formal, certified copy of the unedited cloud footage from camera number 4, Bob explained, looking at me with a desperate, pleading sort of humility. "We need the encryption keys to prove the digital timestamps haven't been altered. Your video is the anchor for the entire lawsuit, Isaac. Without it, her defense attorneys will try to drag this out for years." I looked down at the document. It was a formal request from their legal team, completely devoid of the threatening, green-embossed HOA logos Grace used to love so much. "I already gave the state prosecutor everything they need for the criminal trial, Bob," I said, leaning my back against the workbench. "I know," Bob muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. "But the criminal trial puts her behind bars. The civil suit is the only way these families get their $15,000 back. It's the only way people like Bob from Row 3 can sell their homes and escape this mess. We need your help, Isaac. I know how she treated you. I know we didn't stop her, but we're drowning over there." I looked past him, across the barbed wire, at the empty, blackened lot where the clubhouse used to stand. I didn't hold a grudge against the residents. They were just people who had bought into a pretty promise and let a bully run the show because it was easier than standing up. "I'll have my tech guy export the encrypted files to your lawyers by noon," I said. Bob's shoulders dropped 3 inches as a massive wave of relief washed over his face. He nodded quickly, his mouth twisting into a tight, emotional line. "Thank you, Isaac. Seriously, thank you." He turned to leave, but stopped at the threshold of the shed. "Oh, one more thing," he said, reaching back into his briefcase and pulling out a small white envelope. He set it gently next to my wrench. The new board voted unanimously on this yesterday morning. It's a formal, written retraction of every single civil violation and fine issued to Mendoza Farm over the last 18 months. And an apology, signed by every homeowner in the estates. I picked up the white envelope. It didn't have any embossed gold foil or fancy ink. It was just plain paper, heavy, with 70 handwritten signatures. "Appreciate it, Bob," I said, as his luxury SUV backed down my driveway for what would probably be the last time. I walked over to my wood stove. I held the envelope in my hand for a long moment, thinking about my grandfather breaking this clay and my dad working it until his knees gave out. Then I slid the apology into my back pocket. This one wasn't for kindling. This one I was going to keep. By the first week of October, the autumn air had turned sharp and crisp, carrying the clean, honest scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. The heavy orange haze that had choked the valley all summer was completely gone, replaced by a deep, endless blue sky. I sat up in the high cab of my John Deere combine, the big diesel engine humming its familiar, steady song beneath my boots. Up ahead, the final 60 acres of my golden wheat field rippled under the morning sun, ready for the cutter bars. I glanced out the left window, looking past my eastern boundary fence. The transformation across the line was stark. The charred skeleton of the Evergreen Estates clubhouse had been completely erased. A local demolition crew had spent the previous week hauling away the last of the blackened timbers, scraping the foundation clean, and filling the basement cavity with fresh topsoil. Now, it was just a flat, open patch of graded dirt, seeded with winter ryegrass. 100 yards down the street, right at the corner of the development's main loop, stood Grace Howell's two-story stucco house. It looked empty. The manicured flower beds she used to obsess over were choked with weeds, and the blinds were pulled tight. Planted firmly in the center of her perfect green lawn was a massive, weathered wooden sign that read, "Foreclosure Auction, by order of the county sheriff." The civil court had moved with surprising speed. Between the state's criminal prosecution and the massive class action suit launched by Bob and the rest of the homeowners, Grace's personal assets had been frozen and systematically dismantled. Randy, the mailman, told me a few days ago that her high-priced defense attorneys had stopped showing up to her pretrial hearings after her bank accounts were seized. She was currently sitting in a county jail cell, awaiting a trial where the minimum sentence for first-degree commercial arson started at 10 years. She had wanted to protect her neighborhood's aesthetic value so badly that she had ended up losing her own home to pay for the dirt she'd scorched. I throttled the combine forward, engaging the headers. The sharp, mechanical teeth began to bite into the wheat, swallowing the stalks and spitting a steady stream of clean, golden grain into the hopper behind my head. Dust kicked up from the machinery, drifting lazily in the autumn breeze. As I made my first wide turn along the perimeter fence, I spotted a figure standing on the gravel access road. It was Bob, the new HOA president. He was wearing an old flannel shirt that looked a lot like mine, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't have a clipboard. He didn't have a phone out to take photos. As the massive combine rumbled past him, kicking up a thick cloud of dry chaff and agricultural dust, Bob didn't cough, and he didn't run away. He just stood his ground in the dust storm, looked up at the cab, and gave me a respectful, quiet nod. I raised my left hand from the steering wheel and returned the nod, watching him through the side mirror as he turned and walked back toward his neighborhood. There were no more certified letters waiting in my mailbox. There were no more drones buzzing over my diesel tanks. The 70 families of Evergreen Estates were still broke, and they still had a long way to go to rebuild what their president had stolen from them. But they finally understood what it meant to live next to a farm. I pushed the throttle all the way forward, letting the roar of the John Deere fill the cab, drowning out the last lingering echoes of the suburban kingdom that had tried to fight the dirt. The wheat was coming in thick. The grain bins were filling up. And for the first time in over a year, the land on my side of the fence was completely, beautifully quiet. And that's Isaac's story. Once again, thank you for sticking around. If you enjoyed the story, consider subscribing. It's the best way to help a small channel like this get noticed by the algorithm. But now, I'll turn it over to you. What do you think of today's story? What would you have done if you were in Isaac's shoes? Comment below your thoughts, and I hope to see you in the next one.